So much. This is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to tell you a little bit more about what we do at Revelio Labs. So I'm the chief economist, and I always say that I have the coolest job in the world. I'm a labor economist at a workforce intelligence company, and we have some amazing data that pertains to the labor market. Our goal is essentially to understand employment at any company. And what who people are hiring for, what sentiment is at any company, and yeah, basically just understand like human capital anywhere. um, and just to maybe fill you in on the gaps of what Paolo was referring to just now. We've recently published we've started publishing this public macro labor market data series, essentially as like a complement or, if you will, current replacement for BLS jobs reports. So aggregate employment numbers, changes in employment, job openings, salaries, and hiring and attrition metrics. So the next one will be coming out November 6th, so the day before jobs report comes out. And we started doing it like 3 months ago, and so last month it came in very handy, and I've been a little bit more busy on the PR side and talking to journalists than I usually am. But anyway, that's just a very long-winded introduction to who we are and what we do. Let me actually go ahead and share my slides and tell you why I'm actually here, which is to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we have done at Revelio Labs. I hope, can everybody see my slides? I could just get a quick nod.
Yes,
Yes,
they're good.
perfect. Okay, awesome. To tell you about the state of DEI in the labor market data, or I think as we've been calling it, the rise and fall of DEI in corporate America. So I've told you a little bit about what we do at Revelio. I think it's just important to understand how I'm able to do some of the things that I'm going to show you in terms of statistics. But essentially, yes, we collect, standardize, and curate basically the world's first universal HR database, meaning we essentially scrape a ton of data from professional online profiles, job postings, government data, sentiment data, and put it all together. There's a lot of modeling and thoughtful data science that goes into this to make the data representative, easy to use, and enrich it and basically make time to insights really quick. And we first wrote about the starting fall of DEI roles back in I think February 2022, maybe, or 2020. I should have looked this up, but we had sort of a moment when we went very viral, essentially because we've had uncovered this trend that DEI roles were being let go, or were basically leaving companies at much faster rates than others, especially after some of the big tech layoffs. So that was sort of our claim to fame in this space here, and we sort of continuously track this topic. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the work that we've done here. Without much further ado, let me actually shut up and get into the slides. I won't actually shut up. I need to talk you through the results, but here you're actually seeing some interesting plots, which basically my slides have no words, just plots that I'm going to talk you through. So here we're seeing the evolution of demand for diversity and inclusion roles. They basically like went through the roof post George Floyd death and subsequent protests, and peaked basically somewhere around 2022. And then, basically, the decline was pretty rapid. And at the moment, we're at sort of like negative 50% compared to where they were even in January 2019, at 2019, right? While obviously other roles have remained steady. But let's focus on the rise for a little bit. So in the moment, as companies were adding all these DEI roles, it was actually true that large companies were adding a lot more DEI resources. So basically like almost four DI employees per. I mean, obviously these are still like super tiny teams in um, by any metric, but still at large companies, four DI employees per 10,000. In small companies, much less at about 1.3 employees. Oops. Um, and who were some of the people, or who are some of the companies that actually jumped on that, bandwagon really early and added a lot of DI personnel in those early days? Dropbox was some of them. Twitter, Alturia, Meta, yeah, but like no surprise names here in terms of like if you think back to like 2022 of who went who basically went ahead and hired for these roles. And then this is basically the plot that made us very um, that sort of got a lot of media attention because we sort of publish it as the attrition rate was like at the peak, and we saw that DEI roles were basically leaving companies at twice the pace as anybody else. And the attrition rate, as attrition rates everywhere else, has come down a lot since, but of course at the moment they're coming down from much lower stock levels, right? So lower attrition rates doesn't, is not necessarily the good sign that it looks out to be. And also, the reserves have been quite depleted, which I'll get to in a minute here. So yeah, if we're looking at the total headcount of DI roles at Fortune 500 companies, this is the picture that we're currently getting. So, the good news is that we're not fully back down, or maybe we are. We're like exactly back down to where we were pre 2020. I have another version of this plot where we look at a slightly larger group of companies where it doesn't actually look quite as dramatic. So yeah, in the S&P 500 companies, all progress since 2020 has basically been lost when it comes to the stock of DEI roles, which I suppose in this group here won't surprise anyone. I should have maybe very briefly pause to say how we're defining DEI roles in our data. So we obviously have access to hundreds of millions of resumes, professional online profiles, job postings were some of the metrics that I was showing earlier. And it's really a keyword search on both the raw job titles and the descriptions. So anyone who has any keywords around inclusion, diversity, inclusion, DEI, obviously carefully crafted to make sure that it's in the context of HR roles. But that is how we are defining these roles at these companies, just in case anyone was curious. And then we're also, I was sort of curious to see the impact of this on just like total money spent, just as opposed to like head count. And the picture, yeah, it's sort of it doesn't look like this looks a little bit more optimistic, as in, but yeah, I guess we're still basically 10% down since the peak. And it's hard to see like where the progress is from this since 2020. But yeah, we're definitely definitely down even in terms of like money spent on the DEI roles. And then I think it's really interesting to see where what are some of the companies that have like embrace the fall the most. Not embrace is the wrong word, but have had the biggest sheds in terms of their DEI teams. And yeah, there's a lot of like familiar company names on here. Tesla won't surprise you. Charles Schwab, Chipotle, CarMax, Hasbro. Um, Definitely huge declines in terms of team sizes, which, in fairness, we saw that these team sizes were very, very small to begin with. So if you had a team size of 2 to begin with, and you're now down to 0, you'll get that 90, like you will have that 100% decline. And obviously some of these are not that. But yeah, so not great in terms of the team sizes. Um, it's always, I think, so I find it always difficult to speak about effectiveness in this uh, in this context, because what does effectiveness mean? What we mean here by effectiveness directly is really what is the very direct impact of DEI personnel on the diversity of the company. I know people are sort of always ask me about like more hard numbers on on returns, on on other like hard business metrics. First of all, that's very hard to measure, and then also like what do you want to find? What if you don't find an effect? Do you then want to say that it's not a valid reason to have these teams? I think we can in this context here agree that they have sort of a purpose in their own right. But here we're really looking at effectiveness on the direct metric, as in like, do DI teams make companies that they work for more diverse? And the short answer is yes. Companies with DI teams, like installing DI teams, leads to more diverse hires. So this is a company with a DI team, top bar, no DI team. And we're basically taking away the white share here, just are more diverse in terms of the inflows on average. We also see that companies with DI teams have higher employee sentiment. So just comparing companies with and without DEI teams, yeah, we see that unsurprisingly, the diversity and inclusion ratings are higher, culture and values overall ratings as well. So, this like very clear division, and these aren't small effects. I will say that this particular effect isn't causal, so this is just like a straight up comparison of means. We all know supposedly that, I mean, I assume that companies with and without DI teams are just very different overall. So there might be other factors contributing to the fact that people are happier or not happier. But the fact that the diversity and inclusion rating specifically is so different, I think is a pretty important indication here of the effectiveness. And then interestingly, and this is on like a smaller subset of companies that we're able to do this on, but we see that companies with DI teams have higher sentiment among non-white employees. So that's again sort of very unsurprising, but you really see it in the data. These are hard numbers, and people have higher ratings for compensation and benefits, career opportunities. And here it's very interesting that here the like the hard metrics, the more uh like career driven and business outcome, career opportunity and compensation benefits metrics lead the most, meaning that these DI officers did something to make to really like get the right people through the door and have them be more successful at their jobs and consequently happier about it. Um, on a little bit of the background of DI personnel, we do see that they are more diverse on average than non DI personnel, which is again also no surprise. So then, more credibly can obviously get more of the people through the door. And and this is an interesting analysis that we've done on companies sort of signaling and whether companies walk the walk um, to see whether Pride sponsors have in reality sort of bigger DI teams or not. And we find that they do. There's sort of a massive level difference to begin with. That, in fairness, hasn't, also that trend has remained very parallel, but at least there is that level difference um, in terms of the Pride sponsors versus no Pride sponsors. I think we took the New York Pride in whatever 2023 or so and just went through the actual list of sponsors and companies that had a wagon in the parade. Um, uh, and on sort of this and the topic of pride more generally, these are some of the companies that have the best outcomes for LGBTQ plus employees. So Coca-Cola, Mastercard, and Delta here leading the ranks in terms of the companies that have the most content employees in that respect. And I think we then cross-check these were all indeed also sponsors of the Pride. Um, and then finally, and this is quite an interesting analysis we did on diversity statements in job postings. So you basically looked at companies that had diversity statements specifically, and whether that was sort of pure virtue signaling or whether they were actually acting on the diversity statements. And unfortunately, we do find that it is a lot of virtue signaling. So among the companies that have these these diversity statements in their job postings, we see that they hire a lot more diverse folks into back office roles as opposed to customer facing roles. So, there's always a little bit of that element. So, we spoke a little bit about the rise and fall of DI personnel. I think there's a little bit of this question of what now. And Paula, I don't know if you wanted to interrupt me. I have like two more slides to go, and then we can get in it. Just because I think it's interesting to see what people have done since. So most ex-DI personnel do take on basically completely different roles at different companies. So non-DI roles at different companies. But a majority does stay sort of broadly within like the HR context. We've also seen a lot of education and sort of public and government roles that people go into, as well as academia. So that's unsurprising. But yeah, HR broadly the biggest one. And then this is just something that you know I don't know. I don't actually like having words up on the slides. But Paul and I discussed a little bit, and this comes in a little bit sideways on how I sort of think about meritocracy versus DEI. And in my mind, they're sort of separate concepts that coexist perfectly next to each other in the sense that DI is really about leveling the playing field and recognizing the fact that opportunities aren't afforded equally across the economy. And meritocracy is, the practice of promoting and making sure that the best people are in the best places. And those things are perfectly in accordance with one another. One is about outcomes, the other ones is about inputs. And so together, they can perform powerful things, and they're definitely not at odds with each other. So I'll stop here. I think we have some questions perhaps.